Okay, let's get started. Good morning, good afternoon, whatever time it is, wherever you happen to be. I'm TJ, Principal Consultant, Consulting Operations Manager for Brandwood CKC. I'd like to thank you and welcome you to our webinar for August 2019. Webinar today is entitled Documentation Deconstructed, Understanding Risk Management. This is meant to be another one of the series for creating documentation for medical devices. And, as part of this, we want to go through all of the key aspects of your design dossier, technical file, DHF, whatever applies to you. But today we're going to focus on risk management. Just some housekeeping things to start out with. If you have a question, there's a button at the bottom of your screen that is Q&A. So please click on that, type in your question, and we'll get to it at the end of the session. If for any reason we don't get to it or you have any questions after the fact, you'll see an email at the end of this presentation that you can use or contact us directly, and we'll be happy to follow up with you on that. So let's get started. Today we're going to discuss risk management as we suggested before. First off, we're going to ask the question, why risk management? Then we're going to get into the actual standards that dictate compliance and basically refer to and give you the information that you need for risk management. We're going to do some definitions. We're going to talk about ISO 14971. That's the big boy in this situation. It's the standard that medical devices need to comply to for risk management. So we'll have a pretty in-depth conversation about that. We'll talk about some current developments with the standards, and then some key takeaways and conclusions. But why risk management? Well, effectively, risk management dictates everything when it comes to a medical device. Although there's 4 key categories that we've highlighted on this slide, including patient and user safety, the regulatory responsibilities, product reliability, and business risk management, we really need to focus on the patient and user safety. That is where all of the risk management activities stem from. It is the focus of most of the risk activities as we put these documents together, and it is how we ensure that a safe and effective device is getting onto the market. So risk management is the overall idea for all of these sub-tasks or subtopics, but patient and user safety is at the top and is one of the biggest focuses for us as medical device manufacturers. As we talk about regulatory requirements, so patient user safety being the key component here, but we all know that you aren't going to be able to sell or market your product without the regulatory requirements being met. So there is a responsibility that all global pre-market regulatory approvals apply a risk-based approach to the product development. So what we mean by that is you really need to focus on the risks that may or can apply to your product, and ensure that those are mitigated or controlled in such a way that it provides a safe and effective product for your the end medical device. It's expected that manufacturers adopt risk management processes within their design and development and post-market process. Key here is both sides. So not only when you're designing it and developing this, but also how are you taking inputs from when the actual device is in the field and bringing that back to your design and development to do continuous improvements or to address things that may have not been something that you identified as a risk previously, but now you've taken that in, you're processing it, you're going through the right steps to show whether there's mitigation or any kind of controls in place for those risks. In the EU and Australia, we have to meet the essential principles and essential requirements, and those are 100% based on risk. So there are specific essential principles and essential requirements that suggest how did you identify the risks as it applies to the use of the device. Same thing applies in the US. The US FDA expects that the manufacturers apply risk analysis to the product design. So again, how have you identified the risks associated with your product? How have you attempted to, through design and development activities, control those risks or mitigate those risks? And how are you going to follow those risks up? And then, just to reiterate again, risk management is truly the process of identifying, controlling risks and hazards throughout the life cycle of a product. So again, this doesn't just mean the design and development. This means once it's in the field, how are you going to ensure that there's no new risks or no risks that you have previously maybe miscalculated? You may have said that they're not as severe or they're not as probable. How have you taken that back into your documentation to ensure that your design of your device is still safe and effective? Risk management standards, as we started off, ISO 14971 is the big boy here. This is the application of risk management to medical devices. The unique thing about 14971 is that it's truly a harmonized international standard, and it's recognized by all regulatory bodies. So in that respect, it's kind of a unicorn. There aren't a lot of ISO standards or standards in general that are going to be consensus standards. And the fact that there's one playbook that we can all work off of to meet the requirements for risk management, and that's ISO 14971, is a good thing here, because that means we don't have to do separate things for every regulatory jurisdiction. We need to focus on meeting and complying to ISO 14971. And by doing that, we can then, make all of our regulatory submissions, appropriate for the jurisdictions that they're going to. I will note ISO 14971 is referenced in a ton of safety standards and other regulatory standards. Anything from ISO 22442, which is the BSE, TSC animal products in medical devices, to electrical safety standards, IEC 60601, software 62304, and usability 62366. So they specifically call out the use and the appropriate nature of the 14971 standard. So it is critical that we use this to apply to our medical device in its design and development and in the post-market activities. In addition, ISO 13485, so the regulatory requirements for medical devices, includes references to 14971 and how the manufacturer's quality management system should apply 14971 in your design and development, verification, validation, and post-market activities. We'll get back to 14971, but I want to just bring up a couple more standards that are around the risk management. First one is IEC 60812. That's the FMEA, so failure modes and effect analysis. This standard is a bottom-up determination of effects based on the function, component, or subsystem failures. So really what this one does is it looks at where causes are for failures and then identifies those and applies the risk management strategy in a bottom-up approach. The opposite of that, the top-down exploration, is the fault tree analysis, and that's IEC 61025. That one really looks at the contributing factors that lead to events that create risk. We also have IEC 61882 with the HAZOP. Effectively, that's how your procedural and design issues, deviations, how changing from the path that you have set forward may happen, and what happens when that does. What risks are created when that does happen. And then finally, the HACCP, which is the hazard analysis and critical control points. I bring this one up because it's very important, or it can be a very good tool for those that are doing production risk analysis. So identifying where production risks occur and where critical control points are. So where we can add inspections, testing, anything that can help control the manufacturing process to ensure that you're creating the device in the same manner and not creating undue risk to the medical device that you've designed and developed. With 14971, as we discussed before, this one was specifically designed for medical device manufacturers, and it establishes the principles for use in the risk management process. It's a process for managing risks, specifically, well, or primarily to the end user patient, but it also ensures that other risks, such as operator risks, other persons involved in the use of the medical device, equipment, environmental risks are addressed. 14971 specifies the process in which the manufacturer of a medical device can identify hazards, it can estimate and evaluate the risks associated with these hazards, control and mitigate these risks, and then monitor and the effectiveness of that control. And that's important because that is the life cycle of risk for your medical device. If you can initially identify what the risk may be, and that includes known risks and foreseeable misuse, then you can evaluate those risks. You can attempt to control those risks as much as possible. So we try to find mitigations, we find controls within the process to reduce those risks as much as feasible. And then we monitor how effective that control is. And as we've said before, and I'll continue to push on it, it is for the entire life cycle of a medical device. So risk management does not stop once you've design transferred your device, it's in manufacturing, it's out in the field, it's doing its thing, and you're done with the design and development. That's not the end of risk management processes. There is the feedback loop that takes that information from production or post-production and post-market surveillance and puts it back into this risk management process so that you can evaluate any new risks that are coming up and then identify whether the risks that you've identified previously were correct. Start out with some key terms and definitions. And I think this is important because a lot of times we get stuck on the terminology. So the first one is harm. And harm is really meant to be the physical injury or damage to the health of a person. And it also includes the property, environmental thing. But if we focus on the end user, it's really, will this thing, or what is the physical injury or issue that it creates with an end user? Hazard, on the other hand, is what's the source of that harm? So if we talk about, there's that it could potentially do this thing to the end user, what's creating that? What's the hazard that would create that source of harm? Hazardous situation is effectively the circumstance in which the end user, property, environment, whatever, may become or exposed to one or more harms. So it's really the full scope of where harms can, or where hazards can come from. Risk is the combination of the probability of occurrence of that harm and the severity of that harm. So really looking at, okay, we've identified a harm that comes from a hazard, but how often is that hazard or that harm going to happen? And what is the severity of that harm? Not all harms are created equal. So if we have things that are going to potentially cause hospitalization or have a potential impact of death to the end user, that's obviously much more severe than something that would be, somebody has a negative reaction to how the usability is, or they might get a small distaste for the device. That's not the same type of severity that we're looking at. So we have to grade those things, and that's where we come up with the difference between severity. Risk analysis. This is the overall approach, and this is the systematic use of the information that you have at hand to not only identify the hazards, which are associated to harms, but to estimate the risk as well. Okay. So let's just take some physical examples of hazard, harm, risk, hazardous situation. So the first one, hazard, and that again is a potential source of harm. And the example I have here is a saltwater crocodile. Now that's a hazard, and we know there are multiple harms that can come from that hazard, but that's a pretty clear hazard that you really don't want to be involved with. Well, how does that relate to a hazardous situation? Well, a hazardous situation is really the circumstances in which people, property, environment can be exposed to that hazard or multiple hazards. So the example here is that there's a, if you're a fisherman in the Northern Territories and you're standing in the middle of a croc-infested river, it's probably not a good idea. And you're putting yourself into a hazardous situation where you've got hazards around you that could create harm to you. And understanding all of the circumstances that expose you to those hazards is what a hazardous situation involves. Harm is the physical injury or damage to health of people or damage to property environment. And again, what is the harm from a saltwater crocodile? Well, it's, this would be the least of your worries, is it just a simple bite, but there are multiple recorded cases in Australia a year of saltwater crocodiles taking away people, and unfortunately they lose their lives in that situation. So the harm is very apparent. So how do we get the risk? Well, the risk is the combination of the probability of the occurrence of that harm and the severity of that harm. So here we have an example of some men playing golf on a golf course with a crocodile nearby. Now, there's a risk to that. Now, they believe they've mitigated that risk by giving them some distance between themselves and the crocodile, but it may not be an acceptable risk, or it's a risk that's reduced as far as possible. So that's why we have to identify that and come up with that combination of the probability. So what's the likelihood that this crocodile will attack them? And then if it does, what's the severity of that attack? Residual risk is really when we take the risk and we look at that specifically and we put every control measure we can in place. What's the risk remaining? And that's, here we have a water hole that has a sign and some barriers around getting into it so that you can prevent crocodile attacks. Well, that's, a residual risk. There's some controls in place meant to reduce the overall risk to the end user. And this would be an example of that. So what does that all come back to? So it all comes back to safety. And we talk about this, multiple times. And this is where, for a medical device, it's really understanding how you can ensure that your device isn't going to create undue harm. But when we look at safety, it's really an establishment of benefit versus residual risk. And you want to have, and I don't think you would have a marketable medical device without your benefit outweighing your residual risk. So after all the controls are in place and you've identified what the residual risk is, you need to be able to say that the benefit outweighs that risk. And that is the key fundamental principle for most regulators in the space. They want to see the establishment of a risk-benefit profile that is obvious to them, that it's more beneficial than creating risks. So if we talk about, so let's take a step back and let's talk about how we create a risk management file. Because after all, this is documentation discussion and how we, as a medical device manufacturer, put all of these things together. So there are some general requirements to the risk management file. And again, I'm using the term risk management file as the entire file for documentation of risk assessment, management, so on and so forth. So we start out with management responsibilities. We define who are the people responsible for making the decisions around whether a risk, harm, a hazard is there within your medical device. You have to show that those people are qualified, and that qualification of personnel is very important, because you can't just bring somebody in who says, yeah, I think this is low risk. You have to have some rationale for that. So that may be somebody who's been in the industry for multiple years and have seen the same types of devices and knows the probability of a risk occurring, or it could be a doctor, physician, clinician who says, well, the severity of this is X because it can create a situation where somebody would need to be hospitalized, or so on and so forth. So qualification is important. The next step is you would create a risk management plan. Now, this is the framework that you're going to create your entire risk management file based on. And so this is the starting point for the actual activities in design and development to understand how you're going to evaluate the risk of your device. This is critical, because it will outline the steps you're going to take, the assumptions, the intended use, all of those things. So critically, you need to have that risk management plan locked down. Now, we'll get into each of these individually here in a couple more slides, but just want to touch on that high level. The next one is risk analysis and control. So this is actually identifying hazards, harms, giving them severity and probability scoring or assessment, and then identifying what controls are in place to mitigate those risks as much as possible. From that, we create a risk management report. Now, the intention of the risk management report is to make a declaration that the risks are outweighed by the benefit of the medical device, and that you've met the burden of safety and effectiveness. With that, you're also going to identify what your post-market and post-production monitoring scheme is going to be. So that is critical. That's in the risk management report, because it does it tells a regulator, tells anyone who's looking at your design dossier, your technical file, your DHF, that there may be some residual risk. We've reduced them as much as possible, but we're still going to monitor those. And in addition, these are the other ways that we get feedback so that we can, keep this as an iterative process. And then finally, to add to that, the production and post-market monitoring, it's an absolute requirement for every regulatory jurisdiction that you have to have post-market monitoring of your device. You can't just put it out there and, it does what it does. You have to be able to say that we're monitoring this, we're looking for when there are safety or effectiveness issues, and we're bringing that back into our device, or into our design and development of our device. It may be inconsequential, it may not be significant, but it may be something that is extremely significant that you need to create, recalls, advisory notices, whatever. So that's the last piece in the risk management file. So let's break these down individually. So what we have in front of you here is the risk management process. It's all those steps that we just talked about. And there's two things that I'll point out here. First, the risk assessment. So, there's a lot of terminology that's being thrown around in this space, but what we interpret the risk assessment to be is the actual risk analysis and its evaluation. Risk management, however, incorporates the entire process. So risk analysis all the way through to production and post-production information. The key here is actually the biggest point on this slide is the arrows to the left. And as you can see, there are multiple arrows pointing to the left that basically we learn and iterate and develop knowledge from our device as it's being created throughout the design and development process, but also throughout, after verification validation activities, and then also after production and your post-production responsibilities. As you identify either new risks or changes to your risks or any risks at all, the intention is that it's meant to go back and start the process again and really have that assessment of whether the current scoring, the current assessment or current identification of risk is there, whether it was properly scored from probability and a severity perspective, and then is there more controls. So it is a big loop, and we want to make sure that that's well known to medical device manufacturers, because again, it's an iterative process. As you identify new things, either in your development and design process or at the post-market phase, you want to be able to bring that back into your risk management process. If we start with just risk analysis to begin, there are a few things that need to go into a risk or hazard analysis. The first is your intended use and how that intended use is meant to go with your device. Because we all understand that we have an intended use, and there's a reason why we've created a device and all of the characteristics of that. But understanding what that intended use is and what the parameters are of that are critical for you to identify the risks. The next thing is you'll identify hazards. So these are the things that can create harm, and whether it's potential somebody puts their finger in the wrong place in your device and could get it injured or whatever. If you can identify big thing here is to identify those hazards so that you can put them into an analysis for its overall risk. You need to identify qualitative and quantitative characteristics. So anything that can be actually substantiated needs to be identified in that risk analysis. But the big one here is the foreseeable misuse. Although you have an intended use, and that's the intention for your device and how it's to be used, we all know that as it goes into the hands of clinicians or naive users, there are ways that people can misuse this device. And 14971 doesn't allow you to just say, well, it's not in the intended use, so therefore we're just going to ignore it. You really have to focus on the fact that there are foreseeable misuses, and you need to do your risk analysis to include those. So even though your device might be meant to be used in a clinic or, and by a person who has appropriate training in that, well, what if somebody isn't as trained? Or maybe somebody picks up the device for the first time and tries to get the result that, is intended. Well, what are the foreseeable misuses? And around that could be usability issues. Risk itself, as we've said before, has the two components. Probability, so what is the likelihood of occurrence of harm, and the severity, so what are the consequences of that harm. Between those two, you create a risk profile, and that risk profile is the output of this risk analysis. So for every hazard, you've identified the harms that go with it. Then you take that a step further and you say, what is the probability of the occurrence of this harm? And if it does occur, what is the severity or the consequences of that harm? Next step is the risk evaluation. Risk evaluation, there's a couple things to mention here. So for every identified hazardous situation, you need to decide the criteria in the risk management plan and when risk reduction is required. Now, the table that you see here on the slide, it's very commonly used, and we have this as a part of a lot of our risk analysis and risk evaluation documentation. The key here, though, is that 14971 ensures or requests or requires, I should say, that all risks be individually assessed. So just because you've said, well, it's this kind of risk, and so we put it into the table and it's minor and improbable, we don't need to do anything about it. That's fine, but you need to make sure that each individual risk is assessed. So you need to identify, is there more controls that could be in place? If not, why the acceptability is still there. We use tables like this to help us identify. It triages these risks from low, medium, and high, unacceptable, acceptable, negligible. And it helps us understand which risks absolutely need controls. But again, we don't, as a medical device manufacturer, get away from the obligation of identifying and evaluating each individual risk under 14971. Risk control. So this one has multiple points within it, but we'll get into that a little bit here. So you need to do an option analysis. You need to understand where risk controls are options. There are maybe things that aren't controllable. So where that is available, you need to identify those. You need to be able to implement any control measures. So just because you've identified a control, if you can't do it, then it's not really a control, is it? So things like, testing. Well, we could do testing. Well, we don't actually have, as a medical device manufacturer, the capabilities in-house. Well, can we get that done? Okay, well, we can go out to an outside lab. They can do it. Well, is that feasible? And if it's not, then it's really not a risk control. Then from those risk controls and how they've been applied to those risks, you create an evaluation of the residual risk. And again, that's the risk after all mitigation controls are in place. You'll create your risk-benefit analysis. That risk-benefit analysis is really where the regulators are looking at, how did you prove or how did you show us that the benefit is outweighed or the benefit outweighs the risk for your device. You also need to consider any risks that might come out of the risk control measures. So going back to the example of laboratory testing, what if that laboratory isn't accredited? What if it doesn't follow the right processes for equipment calibration, maintenance, so on and so forth? So other risks that are identified on top of your controls. So controls reduce your risk to the end patient, but are there risks to those actual mitigations? And then how complete is the risk control? So have you done everything you can to mitigate or reduce the risk for your device as much as possible? And that analysis needs to be a part of your risk control. So again, when available or when risk reduction is required, risk control activities shall be performed. And again, going back to, you come up, you do your analysis, you look at the severity, you look at the probability, and you've identified that this is an unacceptable risk. It's a high risk. You need to put some risk control into it. It's unless no other controls can be put in place, then you might have to make that establishment. If it's a high or unacceptable risk and you can't control it, then I don't know if you have a medical device that would be seen by a regulator to be acceptable, because you can't make that argument of risk benefit. If you can put some controls in place and it reduces it to a level of medium, but there are no other controls and that you're going to continue to monitor it, then you still may be able to make the argument for risk benefit. But if it's unacceptable and you can't control it, then it's a hard argument to bring to a regulator to say that you've met the requirements for risk benefit. The risk control analysis, this is, again, identifying the control measures that are appropriate for reducing the risk to an acceptable level. Going back to it, there may be multiple risk control options, and you may be able to do some quite easily in-house, but if they don't reduce it to an acceptable level, then you may have to look at other options. So you may have to look at other risk controls that might be external. They might be bringing in new capabilities or inspections to the manufacturing process, whatever it happens to be. But the identification of all of those control options is a critical part of risk control. And then finally, how can you verify, or how can you ensure that the risk control measure that you put in place actually does what it's supposed to do? So does it ensure that risk is reduced? Now, often we think, well, a visual inspection is going to do it. Or, we check the parts. Well, that may not actually control that, because there are inherent risks with that inspection itself. So if you can't verify the risk control measure suitably, then again, it's not really a risk control. And you have to go back to the fact is this an unacceptable risk without control? In which case you may not meet the risk benefit profile. Next thing is the evaluation of residual risks. So again, going back to the idea of residual risks is the risk of the device once all controls have been placed. You have to identify and do that evaluation. So the evaluation itself, any residual risk shall be evaluated using the criteria defined in the risk management plan. If they aren't acceptable, you must apply further risk controls. From here, you make your risk-benefit analysis, you review the data, you can review literature as well to ensure that you have met the requirements of more benefit than residual risk. If you can't support that conclusion, then the risk remains unacceptable. And again, you're going to have a hard time with a regulator. And frankly, it's not a really good business decision to put devices out there that you can't reduce the risk to be greater than the benefit of the device. And then finally, identifying those risks arising from the control measures. So just because you put a control in place doesn't mean that it doesn't create new risks. And identifying what those risk control measures and the new hazards they may introduce has got to be part of your evaluation of residual risk. Finally, or nearly finally, you create a risk management report. So this risk management report is before the release of the device. You've reviewed all of the risk management processes, and that including the risk management plan, the residual risk, and any risk controls. So once those have been reviewed and acceptable to the XFT, which is appropriately able to determine that they're good to go, then you can create this report. The report also needs to include appropriate methods for obtaining your production and post-production information. So again, it's not good enough to say that we have a risk report that has, from design and development and the initial device that's been created, we've reduced and made all risks acceptable. You have to be identifying where production and post-production risks and that information can be put back into the system. As a result of that, all of these are reviewed and the risk management report is put into the risk management file. Finally, just to further the production and post-production information, there are a ton of areas and a ton of places where this information can come from. So you have the production side, which these can be manufacturing issues. So you may have set up and design transferred your device to manufacturing and everything seems to be going well, and small variances, tolerances start to stack up and you start to have manufacturing issues. As you have those manufacturing issues, you need to be able to put those back into the risk analysis to say whether they're acceptable or whether you need further controls. The other one, and I think this is one of the biggest ones that regulators focus on, are what are the issues with your suppliers? So I don't know of a single manufacturer that has everything in-house. You get supplies from other places and you bring those in. Well, you have to have suitable controls with your supplier, but it doesn't mean that your supplier is not going to have their own issues. So as those supplier issues come in, you need to be able to identify those and then also put those back into the risk management process. From a post-production side, these are all the things that once the device is in the hands of the end users or in the intended use environment, what are the pieces of information that are going to give you additional considerations around the risk? So customer feedback's the obvious one. When we start having complaints, when we start having, a lot of issues with the product being used as it's intended, that's where we need to bring that back into the risk management and determine whether or not the risks that are newly identified, because you may not have seen those up front, whether they've been, if they're newly identified or even just, some changes to your original assumptions of the use of the device and its probability and severity, you need to put those back into the risk management process and then determine whether or not they're acceptable or not and appropriately apply any controls. For devices that require servicing, installation, or maintenance, your service, your staff that's in the field will be a great source for information about the suitability of the device. And when that comes back to you, again, you put it back into the risk management process so you can go through those steps. You can identify whether that is a new harm or hazard that's been created or not a current or not previously identified, or whether you just have something that wasn't identified correctly from a probability and severity perspective. Then going through the process and identifying whether there's controls necessary or whether, what needs to be done to make that an acceptable risk. Adverse events and reportable events for similar products. This is one of the things that is a big push in regulators' minds right now. And as we see more establishments of complaint and adverse event databases, such as MOD and DANE, it's a requirement of the manufacturer to look at other devices that are similar and similar products and take the risks or the hazards that have been identified and apply them to your risk management process. So let's just take an example. If you had a implantable orthopedic product, let's say it's brand new and it's slightly different, you may be able to generate or identify some risks from other people in the space. So the hip implants, or for anybody who's doing a knee implant, you might be able to take some of that information and identify those risks that were specific to those products, but apply it to your product appropriately. And again, there's two things that come out of that. One is identification of new risks, so risks that you wouldn't have identified previously. And the second is whether or not the severity or probability of this happening is appropriate for the way you've addressed it initially. Again, DANE, MOD are great ways to understand trending and understand how often these things happen, because often when we have a novel device or something that's similar to something else out in the market, you may not have an idea as to how often these risks are going to occur. But if you can look at these databases for similar products, then it may give you a better indication of that. Finally, you've got new standards. So as you have, new standards that come up, you need to be able to put those into your risk management process. So if a new standard comes out for usability or for software design or for anything that's related to your device, you need to be able to ensure that you meet that, you're compliant to that standard, but you've also identified any of the risks that were related to the new standard itself. And again, the whole process starts from the beginning. You do your risk analysis, you do your, you go through the controls, you look at residual risk, so on and so forth. So I'll continue to push on it, but the biggest thing that you can take away from this is that this is an iterative process, that after design and development, you're not complete. You continue to bring these things back into the process and ensure that the risk of your device is lower than the benefit that it creates. Okay, so we've talked about 14971 and as the basis for all of our risk management activities. Recently, well, actually just very recently, 14971, the 2019 version, was created into final draft. And we expect that to be published in the next few weeks or so. Key changes here. First one, they've created a guidance to go with it. So this is the ISO DTR 24971. And what really this does is it puts it aligned with many of the other standards, and that you have a guidance document as to how to use and how to apply that standard external to the standard itself. So you now have a document that really shows you how to apply the 14971 standard to your medical device outside of the standard itself. Next one, beneficial to industry and manufacturers, is that they've clarified a lot of the definitions around 14971. So as we talk about harm, hazards, risk analysis, controls, mitigations, things like that, those are all things that have been clarified in the definitions for 14971 as part of the new revision. One of the biggest and most obvious changes to the new 14971 2019 version is that there is a lot more attention being given to the concept of benefit of medical devices. So not just focusing on safety, but actually calling out more requirements or more scrutiny around a risk-benefit assessment and identifying the benefits so that you can give that overall statement at the end that the benefits of your device outweigh the risk. So that is it is critical. It is something that the regulators focus on, and I think 14971 has just made that more apparent. Next one, and we talked about that just recently, and again, this is a regulatory requirement coming from just about every regulator out there, thinking about the requirements of data gathering around similar devices. So it's not just acceptable for you to say, well, it's a novel device, it's a totally different intended use, or it's a different population, or it's a different environment, whatever. That's not acceptable. You have to be able to say that we've looked at similar devices and here are their risks, or here are their risks and they match up with ours, but here are the probabilities and severities that they've come up with. So doing that as part of your DANE and MOD searches, doing that as part of your literature searches to really truly understand what other risks have you not thought about, but also what other risks could you further qualify based on information that's out there. And the last one is that there's a significant focus on the plan. So before, the plan kind of just was this high level document that basically described, it was almost like a reiteration of your risk management SOP. So you would basically say, we're going to follow the same steps that are outlined in the SOP. Here's our intended use, here's our product, so on and so forth. But what the new version of 14971 is really focusing on is getting the plan so that it matches up with all the steps and all the considerations, assumptions, foreseeable misuse. All of those things are put into the plan so that it's very obvious to a regulator, to any external body, at to the steps that you're going to do and did, and obviously the report will follow the did part, but so that they understand everything that you've done in the space. So getting a good plan, and nobody says that it's locked in stone. It's iterative. You can, as you go through things and you identify new things that come up, you can change that plan. But the basics and understanding what needs to be there, and the process that you're going to go through for that specific device, not just a rehash of your SOP, but really focusing on these things are specific to this device, is critical in the 14971 2019 version. So again, just to reiterate, the technical report, the DTR 24971, is the guidance for the application of 14971. And that's already been published. So really, having that available to use it as a cheat sheet, use it as a template, use it as your implementation guide. That's it. Typically, or previously, that content was kind of woven into the standard itself. Now it's an external document. It's very similar to other documents or other standards in the space, but it gives you that guidance, that the ability for you as a manufacturer to understand how you're going to apply 14971 to your medical device. So we've had a bit of a chat on the device, master file, or excuse me, the DHF, the design dossier, the technical file, whatever is specific to your device. But and creating that documentation for the risk assessment or risk management file. But here, there are some key takeaways and conclusions. So first of all, you can't get around it. You have to, with 14971, you have to be able to say that you've done this as part of your medical device development. So it's not just something that you can, we've assessed the risks and, we're happy with it. It's really following that ISO standard and being able to say, yep, in the design and development, we've done all of the appropriate steps from, risk assessment to risk controls to post-market or post-production activities. All of those things have been encumbered, excuse me. It is required for regulatory compliance. As I said, this is one of the unique pieces that every regulator is going to look for. And as we continue to get more and more into this idea where regulators are focusing on the risk benefit profile of a device, it's critical that we have a suitable risk management file to support that. So there's not going to be a situation where, you can kind of just do this lightly and not take this with the brevity that it requires. Regulators, 9 times out of 10, this is one of the first documents that they're going to look at. They're going to look at your report, and if they start to have questions of the report, they're going to work their way back. And, I think in our experience here at Brandwood CKC, risk documentation is one of the first things that come up as far as requests from regulators. So we want to understand what the risks are for this device, how you mitigate those, and how, you plan on controlling those in the future. The next point is it's life cycle planning. So it's iterative. It's the whole thing. It's from start to whenever, your device ceases to be used in the market. Understanding all of those critical components and being able to take those inputs and put them back into the process is critical. So I'll push on this again just because I think it requires that level of scrutiny. When you get to the point where you've done design and development, you should have a pretty well established risk management file. Doesn't mean it's the end. So not only in your risk report are you identifying where you're going to collect production and post-production risks and risk inputs, but having that and being a continuous process so that it feeds back into your risk management file, and you get a good understanding that not only did you assess them correctly initially, but also that you're doing the right thing and that anything that's coming up that you may not have seen is available and being appropriately addressed. One thing that, I often think about when I'm doing risk assessment is the foreseeable misuse. Now, we brought it up as a small bullet point in one of the slides, but when we talk about devices, and especially since we're moving more and more to the point of care and or devices that are going to be used in the home by a naive user who's not a trained clinician, often we don't understand what foreseeable misuse are in its completeness. What really needs to happen, and one of the reasons we mentioned 62366, is that a good manufacturing tactic or a good way to identify other foreseeable misuses are formative usability evaluations. So getting your device in the hands of people that aren't familiar, haven't spent the last 5 years developing the device and are technical experts on it, is critical, because you can have all the smartest engineers from your company sitting at the table, and they're so entrenched in creating this device, and they're so knowledgeable about the device themselves. They think, yep, we've identified any risk that could possibly come up. But as soon as you put it into somebody else's hands, and again, this doesn't necessarily have to be just point of care. It could be a clinician, and you do that formative study, and you look at it, and you go, oh wow, they picked it up in a different way that I would have never expected. There you go. You've got another foreseeable misuse, or you've got other options that would come up as foreseeable misuse. So, I think it is critical that we think about performing formative usability studies early in the process so that we can identify those, because we don't want to rely on, and it's not a good business decision for us to just put it into the field and take that feedback and then make revisions. We want to make sure that we come up with a device that's going to be suitable for use initially. Now, it's a balancing act. We don't want to do so many formative evaluations that we've over-engineered this device, and it's now as close to I don't want to say idiot-proof, but as close to bulletproof as possible. There's a give and take. So having some of those evaluations up front, but also understanding that you will collect some of those as post-production activities is key. Applying the recognized standard 14971 or any of those other standards we've mentioned in the slides. 14971 is the Bible, so to speak, when it comes to risk management for medical devices. But we have to, apply the other standards as appropriate. In some standard cases, it actually just goes back to 14971. So if we talk about software management or software design and development using 62304, there are specific references to ISO 14971 for the development of those risk management plans. So you want to make sure that you're using the right standards, because one, it keeps it understandable to a regulator. Two, it gives you a good starting point for your assessment and internal evaluation. And three, it makes it consistent. And last, we need to plan for some updates. So there's the 14971 standard that will be updated in the next couple of weeks. Like I said, we've gone through some of the key differences, and I think, if anything, I come away from 14971 2019 version a little bit more comfortable. One, I think taking the application guidance out of it and putting it into the 24971 document is good. I think that helps companies understand how to apply that to their device. But two, I think it does clarify not only some definitions, it puts some more emphasis on this risk-benefit profile, and it creates a better plan upfront. So you have a better understanding, and you have a better pathway, map for your risk management activities. So with that, we'll do some questions. So if you haven't submitted any questions, please feel free. Otherwise, I'll take the questions that have been asked so far. The first one I had was a question that came in before the webinar. Effectively, question was asked that, how do we apply, does 13485 production require, or do all companies require production 13485 risk management? And that's ultimately, you need to be able to show risk management for the production side of things. So you'll have to bring in documentation from, if you're doing somebody else is doing your production. If your ISO cert has production within it and it says for the design, development, production, or manufacture of devices, then yes, obviously it's key. You're going to be creating that documentation and you are responsible for it. If somebody else is doing your production, so you're contracting that out to somebody else, that's fine, but you are still the legal manufacturer. You're still the responsible party for the technical file, the design dossier, the DHF, whatever it happens to be. So you need to make sure that you're getting inputs from your contract manufacturer to put it back into the risk assessment. Next question from an anonymous: how will manufacturers best be able to show benefit? Is this something that will require patient outcomes data, such as those used in clinical studies? Yes, and I think there are some other caveats to that. So realistically, manufacturers can best show benefit by not only showing the validation of the device, but also using literature searches and showing in similar devices how that's being used and how the benefit is for patients that have whatever you're trying to alleviate or diagnose, or so on and so forth. So I think it's a combination of both. I think it's understanding what literature is out there and being able to take that in and apply it to your product, but also what validation clinical studies you've done to then further emphasize the point that you are creating a benefit to the end patient with minimal safety or risk, and then being able to apply that accordingly. How can we work out severity and probability of competitor device using MOD or DEAN? This one comes from Ramit. Thanks for the question, Ramit. Ultimately, I think that there's two things. So severity, it really comes back to adverse events are going to tell you what happened. And so if there was hospitalization required, or if somebody had, there's going to be some detail that will give you a level of assurance, or, to your severity assumptions, or it may provide you a new severity for a different risk. So that will come out as part of that input into MOD and DEAN. As far as probability, I think this is where we really use the trending and the number of reported incidences. You need to identify probability in your risk initially throughout the risk management process. But if you go into MOD and DEAN and you start to see a lot of risks or a lot of issues, adverse events happening to a specific risk, you may have to re-educate yourself or reestablish whether or not that probability is right. So that one's more about the totality and the number of risks that are being, or number of adverse events that are being reported. And the severity might be the actual individual assessment of those adverse events. You use the term mitigate several times. The term does not appear in 14971. What does it mean? So again, it's just another word for control. So mitigation is just another way of risk control. So it's a good question, and I use them synonymously. Slight differences, but ultimately take it as risk control. Next one from Stuart. Is the ISO 14971 2019 update aligned with the upcoming MDR and IVDR? Yes, absolutely. So I think this was part of it. It was due for another revision, and there were some regulator inputs that went back to the ISO standards committee that said, it would help if we had more consistent implementation of this. So this is why the TR was created. But the standards committee is just like any other, or the ISO standards committee for 14971 is just like any other. So they take all of the inputs that are out there, including the new regulations. And in my review recently, I would say this is very close to the MDR and the IVDR expectations. Again, your notified bodies for those IVDR and MDR are going to be responsible, are going to expect you to be responsible to show compliance to 14971. From Lewis, how does Brandwood approach supporting clients with risk management? Do you have technical expertise to walk clients through risk? Yes. So effectively, Brandwood, we come from a place where all of the consultants here have industry experience. And so we've been part of design and development teams. We've been part of production teams. We're able to identify not only risk specific to individual medical devices, but we know the process. And sometimes understanding the process and having somebody walk you through, what it takes to make a risk management plan, what it takes to do that risk assessment, how you establish risk controls, and how do you grade these risks. Those are all things that, as medical device manufacturers, we may be familiar with, but getting that input from somebody else and getting some confidence in how you're assessing and how you're scoring risks is critical. So yes, that is something that Brandwood does, and we're happy to help any clients out that way. Last question that we'll take is, can you provide an example of a risk control that can reduce severity? Severity is one of those interesting ones. Severity really cannot be controlled. If you've identified, that your device could create hospitalization, and that's the highest severity risk, it's unlikely that any control that you put in place, unless it's redesign a device to eliminate that risk, will not reduce the severity. So risk controls really focus on occurrence and may increase detection, but that ultimately the intention is to reduce the probability of it occurring. Severity is really related to the harm. So you're not changing the harm, but a risk control is only just mitigate or controlling that actual risk from occurring. So I think it's a good question. And unless there's major design changes to eliminate that harm, which means that you've eliminated the hazard, you're not going to reduce severity. There's a couple of other questions that I'm going to ask that I'll follow up with after this. So please, if you have any additional questions, let me know. My time is up for today, but I want to thank you guys all for attending. I think hopefully this has been very useful for you. Just to point out, if you have anything else after this, you can reach us via the website, help at brandwoodckc.com, the website itself. We've got our Twitter, LinkedIn profiles here, and you can always come back to the YouTube channel for any of the training videos and webinars that we have. So again, if I didn't get to your questions, my apologies. I will address everything after the fact, but please, again, I want to thank you guys all for attending and joining from wherever you're at. And wanted to give a specific shout out to Luis Jimenez, who's our VP of Business Development in the US, whose birthday it is today. So happy birthday, Luis. But thank you all for attending, and I look forward to doing this again soon. Thank you.